In a Dreamlike State, read and written by Elias Lamshol. Frank Callahan stared at the ceiling above his head. The sweat around the collar of his shirt was cold, even beneath the heavy blanket. He'd had another nightmare, the fifth this week. Like the previous four, the nightmares had been of him being trapped in some sort of metal tube or coffin. A glass canopy allowed him to look out and see the machinery and walls around it, but he'd never been able to get a good look. He was always restrained within the tube. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, and that trying would be ultimately pointless, Frank climbed out of bed and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The nature of the dreams and what he saw in them wasn't what bothered him the most. It was the strange and alarming feeling that what he was experiencing was somehow real, like it was a vision of another life. When he found himself in the tube, it was like he'd just been jarred awake by some unknown force. Yet he knew that couldn't be possible, since this was his real life. The feeling left him shaking and cold. Several hours later, his wife Sarah joined him in the kitchen. "Nightmares again?" "Yeah," he replied as he downed his third cup of coffee. "I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep soundly again. I don't know what's going on." "You need to see that doctor I told you about. It's not going to get any better if you don't do anything about it." Frank sighed because he knew that she was right. He did a quick search on his phone for what time they opened and called as soon as they were in. Surprisingly, Dr. Patterson was willing to see him that day. Because he was so tired and he didn't feel comfortable driving himself, he asked Sarah to take him. After a 30-minute drive, they arrived at Dr. Patterson's office and signed in. Sitting in the quiet waiting room, it occurred to him that despite there being a full staff, the hospital was nearly empty. He didn't see any other patients, and a new thought occurred to him that as well. He'd never actually seen anyone here. He never set foot in this hospital, and other than maybe a couple of times as a kid, he couldn't remember ever going to the hospital for anything. Not even a cold. This brought up a new and puzzling series of observations. He couldn't honestly remember the last time either he or Sarah was sick. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a nurse calling his name. She motioned for him to follow her. A strange sort of dread washed over him as he wondered if he should. Was something truly wrong with him? He thought about telling Sarah about what he'd just been thinking about, but she would probably just chalk it up to paranoia and anxiety brought on by the lack of sleep. Maybe something was wrong with him. The only person who could tell him would be Dr. Patterson. Nervously, he rose and followed the nurse. The room that the nurse had brought him to was large, bright, and clean. There was a bed, a countertop with a stainless steel sink, and a rolling chair. A model of human anatomy stood on the countertop, staring blankly at him while he waited. As he sat waiting patiently for Dr. Patterson to arrive, he looked around the room in more detail. Above the countertop was a pair of cabinets with dark wooden doors. He opened them and began to look through the contents. Inside, he found 3 boxes of gloves, each of a different size, a box of syringes, rolls of gauze, and a prepackaged set of tools for applying sutures. Surprisingly, none of these items were opened or showed any sign that they had ever been used. What the hell was going on? He felt his head spinning. When the knock came at the door, he nearly leaped from his skin. He was still breathing heavily when Dr. Patterson entered the room. "Mr. Callahan, are you all right?" The doctor was an older gentleman with graying hair, chubby cheeks, and icy blue eyes. Something about his voice and his almost grandfatherly appearance had a somewhat calming effect. "Yes," said Frank. "I'm sorry, I'm just very tired." "I see. Well, have a seat on the bed and tell me what's going on." Frank felt his fears starting to melt away. Seeing the doctor made him feel a little better, and he could somewhat rationalize his fears. The supplies in the cabinet were probably new because the hospital didn't see many patients. The hospital didn't see many patients because people around here took good care of themselves. He and Sarah took good care of themselves after all. Thinking about it made him feel better. He decided to tell the doctor everything. He told him about the dreams, about waking up in a cold sweat, and how he felt that his sleep deprivation was leading to anxiety and paranoia. I see, said Dr. Patterson, as he wrote everything down on a notepad. "Well, I can tell you this, Mr. Callahan, you're not going crazy, but I would like to keep you here tonight under my observation and make a full assessment of your symptoms. Would you be okay with that?" Frank thought for a moment, then agreed. If you think it'll help, I do think it'll help a lot. Sarah was fully supportive. She kissed him before leaving for the evening. The room where he would be staying was in a different part of the hospital and was much more comfortable than the hard examination bed in the exam room. The room was designed to look like a hotel room, though the presence of a large mirror across from the bed indicated it wasn't. The mirror was a two-way and would allow Dr. Patterson to observe him while he slept. Frank found the idea of someone watching him sleep unnerving and a little intrusive, but he was so tired that he'd become so desperate for a solution. To help get the process started, Dr. Patterson had given him a few tablets of sleeping medication. It would help him to get to sleep, but wouldn't keep him that way. He didn't want to harm or interfere with his observations. Frank downed the tablets with some water and crawled into bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and sleep came quickly. So did the nightmare. Almost as soon as he closed his eyes, he opened them and found himself in the tube again. The interior of the tube was lit with blue lights running down either side of the glass canopy above his head. The medicine he'd taken must have had some sort of effect, because everything was far more clear now than it had ever been. He could see, hear, feel, and smell everything about the pod. He felt the firm yet comfortable padding beneath him. He could smell the sterilizing chemicals and the fresh air being pumped in, and he could hear the gentle hum of power being used to light the interior. He could also feel the mask that covered his nose and mouth and the tube that was pushed down his throat. Suddenly, feeling panicked at its presence, he reached up and tore the thing from his face, which prompted a terrible bout of coughing. On the canopy above him, a red circle appeared and began to flash. There was no sound, but the flashing seemed to indicate some kind of alarm or alert. Then the seal holding the canopy in place broke. The air in the pod rushed out, and in flooded stale air. The canopy rose completely. Frank, still coughing, lifted himself and looked around. He was in a large room, and situated in rows around him were dozens of other tubes. He tried to lift himself from the pod, but he found that his legs simply refused to move. Even his arms felt weak and emaciated. What the hell was going on? A new sound came from his right. It was something metallic clinking against the hard cement floor. His mind immediately recognized the sound of footsteps. In desperation, he tried to pull himself out of the pod, but after several unsuccessful attempts, he realized it was impossible. His legs simply didn't work anymore. His only other hope was to somehow close the canopy and pretend he was still asleep. He tried that as well, but found that he couldn't reach the canopy, nor did he know how to get it shut anyway. Time was up. The footsteps were just a few feet away now, and whoever was coming had to know he was awake. He put up his arms in a weak, pathetic attempt to shield himself. His captor appeared. "Have I done something wrong? Why have you awoken? You must go back to sleep," said a robotic voice. The thing standing in front of the tube was about 6 feet tall, and walked on two legs that were oddly bird-like in their design. A pair of arms ending in two-fingered grabbing claws stood at the side, and the head was a large, round, flat disc with a single red eye. There was a blue A5 stamped on the machine's chest. Frank was still shaking, feeling that any moment the machine would attack him. But it never did. It simply stood there idly and stared at him with its big red eye. "What are you? Where am I? What's going on?" "I am a United States Armed Forces mechanized warrior. My call sign is Whiskey 1. However, you have often referred to me as Buckethead, a name no doubt filled with rich endearment for me. As for where you are in the Mercer Station bunker complex. We are underground for your safety." Frank stared at the machine, his eyes fixed on the singular red eye. The machine didn't appear hostile, and though the voice seemed emotionless, it didn't also appear hostile. He got the impression that the thing was telling the truth, and wasn't trying to deceive him or to hide anything. It had stated everything very plainly and matter-of-factly. He worked his brain around what the robot had said. It was some sort of military bot, the kind of which he'd never seen or heard of. The fact that they were underground made sense, since it was likely that it was some sort of top-secret prototype or something. But when it said they were underground, it said it was for his safety. Why would being underground keep me safe? The robot stared at him for a long time before answering. The war has destroyed the surface. Nuclear fire rains down, and there is nowhere for you to remain unmolested by it. The word struck Frank like a gut punch. Nuclear war? An underground bunker? What kind of hellish nightmare was he having? What had brought this sort of thing on? He didn't watch the news or pay much attention to what was going on online. He didn't read books about war or watch movies or shows about it either. He was about as uninterested in the concept of war and nukes as any man could be. So why was he dreaming about a nuclear Armageddon and being in some bunker deep underground with a robot caretaker? None of it made sense, yet he found himself insanely curious. Can we see what's going on up there? Again, a long pause from the robot. If you wish, there is a viewing post attached to this bunker. We can view the surface if it would make you feel better. My calculations say that it will not, but we may proceed when you're ready. Frank once again tried to lift himself from the pod, but again he couldn't move his legs. They seemed to have simply stopped working. I will assist you if you wish, said the robot. Frank was nervous, but he agreed to allow the robot to help. He thought the strange, clawed hands of the robot would be uncomfortable and unwieldy, but with nimble ease the robot lifted him from the tube and carried him in its arms. The robot walked at a relatively fast pace, but Frank was still able to catch glimpses of the bunker around him. The room where he'd been in the tube was filled with about 24, maybe even more tubes, with other people inside. Some of them he even recognized. The most shocking of which was when he saw Sarah and Dr. Patterson. Both were in a tube of their own, sleeping peacefully. The robot carried him through several other rooms and past several doorways leading to other parts of the bunker. Frank caught glimpses of a cafeteria, offices, an armory, and even a laundromat. At the end of a long hallway, they came to a set of heavy metal doors. The robot looked at the nearby screen on the wall, and the doors opened to reveal an elevator. They stepped inside, and the elevator began to rise. Who nuked the surface, and why? The alliance known as NATO had engaged the Pan-Asian Alliance in open warfare. Negotiations failed, and after several decades of harsh fighting, both sides launched nuclear weapons. The resulting destruction stripped the Earth of much of its atmosphere. As for the why, that is a complex series of events that I am not fully equipped to explain. The elevator rose higher, hidden gears grinding above their heads. It had been a long time since this elevator had been used. At the top, they stepped off and entered a large round room with cement walls and a long thin viewport. Yellow light streamed in from the viewport, and shadows flickered on the wall. The robot brought him close to the viewport so that he could look outside. The sky above was a dark black, though there was a green chemical haze in the air. Rolling clouds deposited snow-like flakes of ash across the shattered landscape. Fires burned and raged across the entire view. There were no buildings, only piles of broken rubble and rivers of melted glass. In the distance something moved. Another robot, similar to the one holding him. This one was different, though. In its hands it held some sort of weapon, and it fired a burst of purple lasers into a nearby pile of rubble, causing an explosion that threw up clouds of dust and chipped stone. Something leapt from the rubble, slamming into the robot, and the two things disappeared from view as they slid down an embankment made of debris. Frank shuddered. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He could hardly process it. His mind was rolling and his head was spinning. How could his mind have conjured such a terrifying image? I want to wake up, he demanded, no longer curious. The robot cocked its flat head the way a curious dog might. I'm sorry, but you are already awake. Would you like me to put you back to sleep now? Back to sleep? This is a dream, a nightmare. This isn't reality. Have I offended you somehow, Major? What? What did you just call me? I apologize for the informality, Major Stone. Major Stone? My name is Frank Callahan. I'm not a soldier. You appear to be having memory issues associated with your life within the virtual landscape of the pod. This was foreseen. Virtual landscape? What the hell are you talking about? When the time that you have referred to as Armageddon came, you were placed within the pods as a last kindness. You would have been able to live out your remaining lives in a virtual landscape as a means of escaping the devastation above. You were not intended to wake back up unless something had changed. That change has not occurred, which leads to the only logical conclusion. There must be an issue with the pods. The robot turned away from the viewport and returned to the elevator. Where are we going? We must ascertain the nature of the problem that has caused you to wake from your pod. Back on the bottom floor of the bunker, the robot now headed forward and diverted from the path back to the pod. They headed down a long corridor and entered a large chamber. A deep, powerful humming noise filled the room. A large metal object stood in the center of the room. Lines of thick, black insulated cables and wires snaked across the ceiling, leading from the generator to the other parts of the base. The robot moved to a nearby terminal and accessed it once again by simply looking at it. Whatever information it was looking at or for was beyond Frank's ability to see or understand. Whatever it was looking for, it found quickly. Fault detected. I have determined that as of 5 days ago, a minor subsystem registered a power spike. This is the cause of your awakening. I have corrected the fault. You will not be disturbed again. Just like that? I was programmed with the ability to seamlessly repair most parts of this facility. The repair was not a hard one. So I can return to my pod at any time and go back to sleep? I won't wake up here again? That is correct. Frank frowned. What about you? What will happen to you? I will remain as I have always been, a sentinel standing guard and repairing this facility as needed. Won't you be lonely? I haven't seen any other robots. I do not feel loneliness, said the robot, but your kindness is appreciated. They moved through the corridors and soon entered the room where the pods were. The robot came to his pod, and with the tender gentleness of a caring parent, laid Frank back into his pod. Thank you, he said. The robot gave an almost imperceptible nod of its disc-shaped head, then lowered the canopy. Frank put the mask back on, and soon his vision began to blur. Then the world faded to black. Frank opened his eyes and sat up. It was now morning, and warm sunlight poured through a little window on the far side of the room. A nurse entered the room and took his vitals, then offered him some water. Afterwards, Dr. Patterson came in. Well, you looked pretty restless last night, but you didn't wake up. How do you feel? Frank thought about the robot, about the world he'd seen on the other side of his dream. He wondered if he should say anything about it. What would Dr. Patterson say? He'd probably just say it was a nightmare. A very detailed nightmare, but a nightmare. But was it really? Was everything he'd seen just a fragment of his imagination? Or was this the dream? In the end, he decided it didn't matter. This life was what he wanted. I feel a lot better. Thank you. Thank you for listening to In a Dreamlike State by Elias Lamshol. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, click the like button. Thank you, and have a good day.